He never asked where they were from, what work they did, or how loudly they professed belief. When the teacher entered a crowded room, his attention moved in a way most people didn't notice. It wasn't scanning faces for familiarity or judging posture or devotion. His gaze went straight to the eyes. Not to emotion, not to personality, but deeper, into the structure itself, as if he were reading a language written beneath color and light. And the versions that survived, this moment was simplified. He called certain followers. He felt led to choose them. Chance, destiny, divine whim. But the earlier accounts described something more precise. A quiet verification. A glance that lasted just long enough to confirm whether a person could carry what came next without fracturing. In this retelling, the teacher is called Ilarion, and the gathering doesn't happen in a public square but in a stone-walled room beneath the city, where lamps burn low and sound doesn't travel. The crowds above hear stories about fields and seeds, about fairness and mercy, truths designed to steady ordinary human life. Down here, something else is happening. Not everyone present is meant to stay. Ilarion doesn't announce the division. He simply teaches. And as he does, some listeners feel nothing more than interest, maybe comfort. Others feel pressure, like something inside them stirring, asking to be named. Those are the ones he studies more closely. Their eyes catch the light differently, not because of color or brightness, but because of pattern. According to the suppressed tradition, consciousness doesn't enter the body cleanly. When a higher-order awareness compresses itself into matter, it leaves a trace. Not a metaphorical one, a physical signature. The eyes, formed early and wired directly into perception, become the interface where that compression marks the body. Most human souls develop normally, with irises shaped by biology alone. But when a monadic consciousness incarnates, the iris carries geometry. Frequency made visible. Ilarion knew this. He had been trained to see it long before he ever spoke publicly. He knew that activation, true awakening, was not a universal process. It wasn't inspirational speech or moral improvement. Activation meant reigniting something dormant but already present. Trying to do that with someone who didn't carry that structure would cause confusion at best, harm at worst. So he filtered, quietly. When he spoke to the many, he used images and rhythms that grounded them. Stories that worked on the level of daily life. But when he noticed the pattern in someone's eyes, he paused. He watched how they listened. How their attention didn't just follow words but seemed to reach behind them. Later, he would pull them aside. No ceremony. No announcement. Just a different conversation, one that assumed something awake beneath the surface. Those chosen for the inner work weren't better. They weren't morally superior or more disciplined. They were different in function. Like instruments tuned to a range others couldn't hear. And Ilarion treated that difference with care. He never tried to convince someone they were something they weren't. If the eyes didn't show the mark, the teaching stayed simple. This distinction didn't survive intact. Centuries later, when institutions began to organize around uniformity, the idea became dangerous. If some people were built to awaken in a specific way and others weren't, the promise that everyone needed the same path collapsed. Authority depends on sameness. Control depends on universal rules. A visible marker that bypassed priests, rituals, and approval couldn't be allowed to remain. So the criterion vanished. The selection became symbolic. The inner circle turned into a moral example instead of a functional one. What remained were fragments, whispers that some teachings were not for everyone, stripped of explanation and left to sound elitist or cruel, but in the older frame, it wasn't about worth. It was about compatibility. You don't teach advanced navigation to someone without the internal compass. You don't demand a function from a system that lacks the component. Those who did carry the mark often sensed it long before they had words for it. They felt out of sync with standard explanations of life. Not superior, just misaligned. As if the instructions everyone else received didn't quite fit. When Ilarion looked at them, there was recognition, not surprise. As though he was confirming something they already half knew but had never been taught to verify. The eye was the proof. Unarguable, permanent, present from birth. Not belief. Not faith. Structure. That's why the tradition insisted the teacher could identify readiness instantly. He didn't test loyalty or knowledge. He checked the interface between awareness and flesh. In that interface, the truth was already written, and once you understand that, the rest of the story rearranges itself. The crowds, the parables, the secrecy, the accusations of withholding knowledge, it all points back to this single, quiet act of discernment. A look. A pattern seen. A decision made, not to exclude, but to avoid forcing awakening where there was nothing to awaken. What Ilarion looked for wasn't vague or symbolic. It wasn't spark in the eyes, poetry. It was structure, repeatable, visible to those trained to notice it. Over time, the Watchers learned there were 3 expressions of this imprint, 3 ways the monadic signal translated itself into living tissue. Each one shaped how consciousness moved through a body, how awareness interacted with the world. The first was the transmission form. In these eyes, the iris carried pronounced radial lines, extending outward from the pupil like spokes on a wheel. Not the faint striations common to most eyes, but deeper, clearer lines that caught light at certain angles. When you saw them, you didn't need to count or analyze. The geometry announced itself. Those who carried this pattern affected space simply by entering it. They didn't need to speak to be felt. Rooms settled or intensified around them. Conversations shifted tone. People oriented toward them without knowing why. In the inner teachings, these were called stabilizers. Their consciousness naturally broadcast coherence. When activated, they became anchors, points around which others unconsciously organized. Ilarion placed these people carefully. He never pushed them forward too early, because their influence operated even when they were unaware of it. Once awake, they learned restraint as much as expression. Their task wasn't dominance. It was alignment. The second form was the reception pattern. Instead of spokes, the iris showed rings, concentric bands circling the pupil, sometimes subtle, sometimes sharply defined. 2, 3, sometimes 4 layers, like ripples frozen in place. These eyes didn't project. They absorbed. People with this structure were always the ones who just knew. They sensed outcomes before events unfolded. They dreamed with clarity and remembered. Information came to them sideways, without effort. In the untrained state, this could feel overwhelming, like static. Once activated, it became precision. Ilarion treated these individuals as listeners first. He spoke less to them, asked fewer questions. He knew their challenge wasn't access but filtration. They had to learn how to receive without drowning. In the inner circle, they became seers, not prophets in the dramatic sense, but interpreters of pattern, translators between levels of reality. The third form was the rarest and most destabilizing, the integrative pattern. These irises appeared segmented, divided into distinct zones, sometimes with subtle shifts in color or texture, sometimes sharply delineated. To the untrained eye, it could look like a defect or anomaly. To those who knew, it was unmistakable. These individuals lived in overlap. They were never entirely here, never entirely elsewhere. Their memories didn't line up cleanly with a single timeline. They experienced déjà vu not as a feeling but as recognition. Their dreams felt like visits. Their waking life felt provisional. Ilarion approached them with caution and respect. They were bridges, but bridges crack if overloaded. Their activation wasn't about opening perception, it was about stabilizing it. Teaching them how to stand with one foot in each realm without tearing themselves apart. All three patterns shared one thing: permanence. They weren't acquired through practice or belief. They formed as the body formed. That was the uncomfortable implication later authorities couldn't tolerate. If structure preceded doctrine, then doctrine wasn't the gatekeeper. That's why the knowledge narrowed. First, the language softened. Geometry became metaphor. Then metaphor became allegory. Eventually, the entire concept disappeared, replaced with the idea that everyone followed the same arc, just at different speeds, but the experience of recognition never vanished. Those who carried the patterns often described the same moment, seeing their own eyes clearly for the first time. Noticing something that had always been there. The shock wasn't excitement. It was relief. Like finally understanding why certain teachings resonated and others felt flat. Why some spiritual practices felt like remembering, not learning. In the old accounts, this moment was called recollection. Not awakening something new, but removing interference. The body already knew. The eyes already showed it. The mind just hadn't been trained to connect the dots. Ilarion never framed this as hierarchy. Each form had limits as well as capacities. Transmitters could overwhelm. Receivers could lose grounding. Integrators could fragment. Activation was never about turning someone into something else. It was about teaching them how to operate what they already were without harm. That nuance didn't survive simplification. What survived was the faint sense that some people carried a different load, that certain teachings landed differently depending on who heard them. Stripped of explanation, that difference became taboo, but the patterns remained, quietly present in mirrors and photographs, waiting for someone to look without being told what they were supposed to see. By the time the tradition hardened into institution, the damage was already done. What couldn't be standardized had to be erased. A visible marker that allowed individuals to verify themselves without permission threatened every layer of control built on obedience and sameness. So the knowledge didn't disappear all at once. It thinned. It softened. It was reframed until it no longer functioned, the selection process became a story about virtue. The inner teachings became symbols. Activation turned into belief. And the original practicality, the quiet act of looking, recognizing, and responding accordingly, was labeled dangerous, divisive, or heretical, yet the experience itself never stopped happening. People still grew up feeling slightly misaligned with the world around them. Not superior, not broken, just tuned differently. They gravitated towards certain ideas effortlessly and bounced off others without understanding why. Some affected rooms by simply being present. Some received information they couldn't trace to logic. Some lived with the constant sense of standing in two places at once, without a framework. They internalized it. They assumed it was imagination, trauma, sensitivity, ego. Anything but structure. That was the real suppression, not the removal of a text, but the removal of a mirror, because once you know what to look for, verification doesn't require belief. It doesn't require a teacher or a lineage or approval. It takes light, stillness, and attention. The iris doesn't perform. It doesn't change based on desire. It either carries geometry or it doesn't. That's why recognition feels like remembering. There's no thrill of discovery, no rush of revelation. Just a quiet click into place. This explains it. This is why, and this is also why the teaching was dangerous. A person who can verify themselves doesn't need to be convinced of who they are. They don't need to be managed through guilt or promise. They don't need to chase awakening as a future reward. They adjust their life around a fact that's already present. In the older accounts, this moment marked the beginning of responsibility, not privilege. Once you knew your configuration, you were expected to live accordingly. Transmitters learned containment. Receivers learned discernment. Integrators learned grounding. Activation without discipline was considered reckless. That part mattered. The knowledge wasn't meant to inflate identity. It was meant to prevent misuse. Which is another reason it didn't survive. Discipline without dependence doesn't scale well. Today, the situation is reversed. People stumble into recognition alone, without guidance, without language, sometimes without balance. They notice the pattern and don't know what to do with it. The old tradition assumed teaching would follow identification. Now identification happens in isolation. That's why this reconstruction matters. Not as doctrine. Not as belief. As context. If you look and see nothing distinct, there's nothing missing. You're having the experience you're built for, and it has its own depth and purpose. But if you do see it, if the structure is obvious once you know how to look, then the question isn't, am I special? It's, how am I meant to operate without distortion? That was always the point. The teacher didn't divide people to elevate some and diminish others. He differentiated so he wouldn't damage anyone by giving them what they weren't designed to carry. The tragedy is that this care was later reframed as secrecy, and secrecy became control. What remains now is choice. Not belief. Not allegiance. Choice. To look. To verify. To stop guessing who you are based on feelings and stories and start from structure. From something that doesn't argue back. The mirror hasn't changed. Only the permission to trust what it shows. If you stayed with this all the way through, take a moment before rushing to the next video. Let the ideas settle instead of stacking them on top of each other. This kind of material isn't meant to be consumed quickly, it's meant to recalibrate how you look at yourself and at others. Even disagreement is useful if it sharpens your attention rather than dulling it. If this perspective resonated, share it with someone who's been quietly questioning themselves for years but never found language that fit. Not to convince them, just to let them decide whether it matches their own experience. Sometimes the most helpful thing you can offer is a lens, not a conclusion. If you want more explorations like this, where suppressed frameworks are reconstructed carefully rather than sensationalized, subscribe to the channel. Upcoming videos will go deeper into how these patterns were originally worked with, not just identified, and how misusing them created many of the distortions we still see today. If you found value here, tap the like button to help this reach people who aren't actively searching but might recognize themselves when they hear it. That small signal matters more than most people realize, and if you have thoughts, experiences, or even strong objections, leave them in the comments. Not for debate, but for pattern recognition. You never know who's reading quietly and realizing they're not alone in what they've noticed. Thanks for being here, for listening closely, and for taking your own perception seriously.